When you first start weaving, there are so many little tiny things that you forget about or you're not sure about that can impact the final product of your weaving. One of the toughest things as a weaver is figuring out how to have clean selvedges, and that is having the sides of your project look crisp and clean. Of course, this depends on the type of weaving you're doing and the type of loom you're using because they're all a little different, what you're using for your shuttle, how much tension you have. So I'm going to show you what I do, and hopefully this is helpful. If you're new to weaving and you're not sure what a selvage is, the selvage really is the side of your weaving. And so you can see here on my Saori loom, I'm not being as careful about how straight this line is. I have a little bit more of a flexible edge here, so not every loop is finished at the exact same spot. Whereas this one, which was done on my other loom, has a very neat and consistent edge. And so it really does take practice and getting used to tension in order to be able to make sure that whatever it is that you're creating has the type of selvage you want. So let's talk about what creates a nice clean selvage and how you would want to use that. First of all, you want to have the correct tension on your project. So if you have a side that is looser, which definitely happens to me often, then you'll find that when you pull your shuttle through, it's going to pull those threads in a little bit tighter on the side just because your warp threads are loose. So you want to make sure as much as you can that you have even tension and that you have a pretty good amount of tension on your warp threads. You also want to make sure that there isn't too much tension on your weft thread. If you have too much tension, it's going to draw in the sides of your project, and that will impact how it looks in the end. And you also don't want to have too loose tension, because if it's too loose, you're going to end up with those bumps on the side where your weft thread is looping around the edges. So in order to get consistent at that, I know for me what I did was I picked one shuttle. I know lots of people use different shuttles and have different techniques, but I picked one that I was comfortable with. And I used that one until I felt really confident with how much tension I was using. And so I felt like I didn't have to master the tension piece and then could decide to start to work with different materials. So as an example here, this was something that I wove on my Saori loom, and you can see how I have this black line that runs down the side. Well, that's because it was my first time using the loom, and I found that I didn't have enough tension on the sides. And so as I was moving my shuttle back and forth, you can see it's actually just pulling, these are warp threads that are pulled together into a tight cluster. And so that's what's creating that line. On the other hand, on the other side, I was using a silk here that had a bit of a different texture. So you'll see it's not quite the same. Although I do have some spots where I have that line, I was much more able to regulate the tension because this was a bit of a thicker weft. And also because I didn't have the same amount of pressure. I wasn't using the shuttle on this side. I just had a ball of it sitting down beside my loom, and I would pick it up and pull it across. So it looks a little bit different. When you're using different textures, you can also use your selvage as part of what draws your eye to the weaving or the project. And so this is a hand spun, it has a lot of different textures, and I liked playing around with having a really messy selvage because it's part of the look. It creates a little bit of the structure of the material, and I think it's part of the fun of Saori weaving. So while practicing is the #1 best way to get good at having clean selvages, you can also experiment with different types of materials and also with the angle that you use when you're putting your weft threads through. So I'm going to give you an example here. So my threads are quite thin in my warp. In fact, they've snapped quite a lot, so I don't love that, but I'm using a much thicker thread for my weft. And so when I put my shuttle through, you don't want to pull this tight, because you can see if I pull this as close as I can to my works before I beat, you can see how it's pulling in the sides here, which is really not what I want. And so instead, what they suggest you do and what you should get comfortable with is either one of two things. You can make a bit of an upside down U shape like this, or for me, I just have it on a bit of an angle. I don't have it straight across. I just give it a little bit of extra room on the side that my shuttle is coming out on. And the reason why is because I want this side to be relatively neat. So when I beat, If there's any extra on this side, it's going to just get pulled out by the shuttle when I use it on the next row. And on this side, it stays fairly clean. If I don't do that, and I'll give you an example here. So if I pull my shuttle through and I leave a little bit of space on this side, and then I add in the extra angle, what's going to happen is when I beat, I'm going to have this loop here on the edge, which is not what I want. So, and if this does happen, the way to fix that is you're just going to switch your heddles again and then just pull it a little bit tight. And that will pull that side back in. So the main thing is you don't want too much tension, and you also want to give yourself a little bit of an angle so you have some slack, and that will help you to not pull your sides in while you're weaving. You can also use a stabilizing bar, and it just basically pulls tension from the middle out to make sure that you're not pulling the sides in. So if you struggle with keeping tension, you can buy those bars from most places that sell weaving supplies. I find them irritating, but I know there are definitely times when it's helpful to have that extra bit of stabilization on your work, especially if you're dealing with a complex pattern. So that is another option if you're struggling with having a nice clean selvage. So just to recap, the three main things you want to have a nice clean selvage is enough tension on your warp threads. You want to have a little bit of flexibility on your weft thread, and you want to make sure that you don't pull your weft thread tight when you're pushing your shuttle through. And also, if you're getting started, just go slow. It's much easier to take the time to get the technique right. And the more you practice it, the faster you're going to be able to go, because it becomes a little bit like muscle memory, and you get used to how much tension you need, and you get used to how hard you're going to throw your shuttle. So it just takes practice. So just start slow. Check at the end of every row as you're going to make sure that your selvage is where you want it to be. And if you notice your project is starting to tighten up into the middle, or it's looking like there's a lot of loops on the edge, just take the time to, at the end of every row, make sure that it looks okay, and give yourself enough flexibility that you're not drawing that tension back in on your project. The more you do it, the easier it gets, and the faster you're going to get at weaving. And the faster you get at weaving, the easier it's going to be to maintain a consistent selvage. So just give yourself time as you're getting started, because the worst thing is you have a plan for a big project like a scarf, and halfway through it you realize you weren't paying attention and it looks really wonky on the edges. Just pay attention as you're doing your first few projects. Take the time at the end of each row and make sure that your selvage looks all right. I hope this was helpful, and please share any questions or comments that you have below, and I'll do my best to answer them.